Hello and welcome to the latest in the first Wednesday series from NSF. I'm going to talk about a remediation case study that I personally worked on. My name's Lynn Byers. I'm the Senior Vice President of Pharma Consulting for NSF. Just to introduce myself, so I've worked in the industry and as a regulator for more than 40 years now. I've worked for big major multinational companies such as GSK, UCB and Novartis, and also spent a couple of years working as the head of inspectorate for the MHRA. So I've worked for NSF for 4 years now, and I'm based in the UK, but have global responsibility for the consulting side of the business from a pharma biotech and also dietary supplements perspective. First, I'd like to introduce NSF. So NSF is an independent, not-for-profit, non-governmental public health and safety organisation. And our mission and focus has always been protecting and improving human health. And our organisation works on standards, and particularly the ANSI standards. We have a lot of quality control testing laboratories globally. We do certification against those standards I've mentioned. We're very careful to make sure that there is a wall between our consulting and training business so that there is no sense of conflict of interest between that and the certification business. So I work on the training, consulting, and also the gap assessment audits that we perform routinely. What I'm going to talk about today is a situation. I'm going to talk about the management's response to that situation, what NSF did. I'll talk about our interactions with the regulator and what lessons that we learned from the particular situation, both as NSF, but also the company that I worked with, and also perhaps to share some of those lessons that might spark something in your mind and think, I need to learn about that. So the situation was that a company had a critical finding from a regulatory inspection. And obviously that's always bad news. A critical finding, if you look at the EMEA and the European regulators, I'm going to stop there.
That's fine.
The situation.
Give it a second and then start with the situation after a 2-second gap.
The situation that I'm going to talk about is a critical finding from a regulatory inspection. Now, a critical finding is always bad news, and a critical finding, whether it be from the UK regulator, the MHRA, or the European regulators, the EMEA, basically means that there is a potential risk to human health. What happened at the site was, as soon as the regulatory inspection was completed, they suggested to the site that they wrote a position paper. And that, what was suggested by the regulators was perhaps to cease manufacture voluntarily and also provide some immediate corrective and preventive actions. Secondly, the response to the inspection. So what happened was there was verbal feedback first, and then there was a written letter received by the site from the inspectors, and that required a formal corrective and preventive action response. The site responded, but because the regulators weren't satisfied with the response, that led to multiple requests for information and further details. What the regulators also did was they sent letters to the qualified persons who were named on the manufacturing import authorization to explain their actions, really to ask about what level of oversight did they do, why had they continued to release batches from the site, why had they not seen the GMP deficiencies that were in place. And next, there was a request for risk assessments. Clearly there was product on the market and the regulator needed to see the risk assessments to make sure that that product needed to be retained on the market or whether it needed to be recalled. However, what happened within a couple of weeks was the manufacturing import authorization was suspended. So the MIA was suspended. Many of you may not understand the impact of such a suspension, but what that means is that the site activities that are listed on the MIA must stop. And the activities that are on an MIA are the ability to manufacture product. You cannot perform QP certification, you cannot perform routine testing, and if you're importing product into the site, you cannot import product. So if you have a 100% suspended MIA, any activities on that must stop. Now, some activities can continue because they are basically supporting what is already on the market. So things like stability testing can continue. But just imagine you're a site of perhaps several hundred people and suddenly you have to stop. What do you do with the people? You can't even forward process, for example, bulk granules into tablets. You can't film coat the tablets. You cannot pack the tablets. Everything is pretty much frozen in time. So it's a very, very big issue for a company. So what did the company do? I've already talked about some of the communications that the company had, but you imagine you're the management team. You would be shocked. You would probably challenge the decision, and indeed the company did challenge the decision. But also what I would suggest is that the management did not understand the seriousness of the situation, nor the timeline to fix it. The company had responded very quickly with multiple commitments, but they somehow sort of lost track of what commitments had been made. And clearly the regulator was not satisfied as they kept asking for more information. It became very confusing about commitments and proposed and agreed timelines. Again, the company gave some very tight timelines, but meanwhile the regulator sent back asking for more information. And by that time, the commitment date had passed. And what the company didn't do is do a very clear communication back to the regulator to say, okay, we said we'd do Kappa X by a certain date. We've now passed that date. You now want X plus something else. We'll have to go with new dates. So that's something that became very confusing and not very clearly managed by the company. So when did NSF get involved? Interestingly, NSF were requested to quote for a 3-day mock inspection before the actual inspection took place. Unfortunately, that wasn't approved by management, so there was no pre-inspection work. Immediately following the inspection, we did 3 small pieces of work performed in about 2 months following the inspection. So this wasn't a review of the CAPAs or anything, this was just some technical pieces of information, technical work that we completed. And then 3 months post-inspection, we then received a request for much more holistic support to the site. And that meant preparing much more detailed quality improvement plans. And interestingly, that support lasted for more than 2 years. So it was not a quick fix to the problem. So the scope of work that we had initially was to look at the commitments that had been made and what commitments had gone into the pharmaceutical quality system. And also we looked for evidence of closure and the effectiveness of those CAPAs. Now, as I mentioned before, the communication got somewhat challenging to start with. And what I didn't mention was a couple of the QPs who'd been asked to basically explain what had happened decided to withdraw their services from the site. They were contract QPs and they effectively withdrew. And that meant that the site was very short of experienced people. So firstly, we looked at the commitments and made sure that nothing was lost. The next thing we did was prepared a project plan to regain approval. and that was split into 3 different areas. So if you remember what I said before, it is not possible to perform any GMP activities if you've lost your MIA. So we prioritised the activities into what activities needed to be in place before manufacturing could be restarted. And of course, manufacturing could not be restarted until there was a successful MHRA inspection. The second area were pre-QP certification activities. So moving from reinstatement of the manufacturing import authorization to then QP certification. Batches needed to be ensured that they met the validated conditions, and in fact we went through a revalidation process of the manufacturing activities, and therefore we couldn't do those until the pre-QP certification point. And then following that, there were some activities that could only happen post-restart, for example, putting batches onto stability. We provided many subject matter experts from validation and facility design, QC, QA, training. And what was quite interesting, this was taking place during the pandemic, and it gave us the opportunity to actually use our experts, not just in the country in which this was taking place, but actually experts from other parts of the world. And so we were able to just have Teams meetings and provide written feedback with people from different parts of the world. So that enabled us to be able to use our global experts. Interactions with the regulators. Sometimes NSF and other consultancies get involved with regulators. So, for example, in the USA, if we're the representative of the company, the US agent, as it's called, then we would typically get quite involved. In other parts of the world, it's not so typical. But in this particular case, we did participate in multiple calls with the regulators. And the regulators were very interested in the details of NSF's involvement in the site. They wanted copies of our statements of work, the CVs of the people who were working on it, the quality and technical agreements, right down to how many days a week we were planning to be there and what level of agreement and participation we had in the various documentation and systems and processes on the site. One of the other pieces of work they asked us to perform was an independent audit of the site. And what we did here was we selected a couple of our independent consultants who had had nothing to do with the remediation project because we wanted a true independent review of not just the site's work, but obviously the NSF's consultants' work as well. And quite interestingly, the regulators asked for a copy of that, and they used that audit as part of one of their follow-up inspections. NSF, myself, I had to provide written confirmation that I concluded when the site was inspection ready, so that they had someone like myself who was more independent to confirm inspection readiness at the site. And then once the MIA was reinstated, NSF and the client agreed a transition plan for removing the NSF support. But we never want to be in a situation where we're at a site all week, every week. We need to move away and make sure that the site is able to stand on their own 2 feet to actually move forward into a more sustainable situation. But then post-manufacturing restart, we provided close oversight. So the regulator wanted us to approve validation reports. I participated in management review meetings. Initially, these were taking place every week, but as things became more in control, the frequency reduced. And also the regulator requested a review and approval of monthly metrics provided to the regulator. So all this time, the regulator was really thinking of us as their eyes and ears on the site. So what were the lessons learned? I think the lessons learned is please, if you're going to have an inspection, and particularly if you're going to have an inspection from a regulator that you've not had previously, it's far better to have an independent third party perform a pre-inspection audit and understand the gaps before the inspection. At least you could put some plans in place to make sure that you could perhaps discuss them with the regulator. If you have a poor inspection, please involve an independent, experienced person immediately. Please do not make commitments. I'm not suggesting always you need to use a consultant, but you need to use someone within your own company who has experience of this. It will also take much longer than you think to bring a site back into compliance and regain your MIA than you think. In this particular example, it was 12 months. My experience would suggest probably a minimum of 6 months. If you're a site that's outside of the jurisdiction of the regulator, perhaps you're in a third country, it might take longer because the regulator would need to prepare and plan for an overseas inspection. Good project management's critical. Deciding which are the critical activities to perform in which order is really important. And maintaining the morale and focus of the people on the site. Certainly we became a sounding board and very much a trusted partner to the site staff. They had a really tough time in terms of having the poor result from the regulatory inspection, the fact that the site manufacturing, packaging and release activities had to stop. And so what happened was a lot of activities fell on the shoulders of very few people. And then the other lessons learned is that the regulators do like independent third parties. Certainly with the US FDA, we see this very typically, but we're seeing other regulators introducing this. And the MHRA in the UK have recently announced the introduction of a pilot scheme for a compliance monitor who would do the sort of activities that we've done here. That will be starting probably in May, very, very soon. This was nice. This was the company chief executive, and he gave us this quote: that NSF were instrumental in ensuring our turnaround plan met all the regulators' concerns. NSF were our trusted advisors during an exceptionally difficult period, providing sounding board at board level and input on strategy whilst deploying technical experts at sometimes very short notice to cover gaps in competence or expertise internally. And we do have the advantage, we do have a very large network of people in many different technical areas, and that is brought to bear in situations like this. So I'd just like to thank you for listening. You have my email address there. I hope you've enjoyed our series of the first Wednesday events, and our next event is with Sanjay Shetgar, who's going to talk about the Indian pharma market, and that's in July. Please feel free to contact me, book a call with us, and we're always very willing to talk to you. So thank you very much, and goodbye.